Good afternoon. It's good to see you. We are in a series entitled Jump In, continuing a look at what it means to go from a fan to a follower. If you bow your heads with me really quickly again. God, I just pray in this moment that this message that has been a catalyst for me might be a catalyst for someone else to ultimately make continuous room in their heart for you. In your name I pray, amen. It was the summer of 2020. I know for many of us that means many different things. The pandemic had really reached its heights at that time, and every industry, every area of our world was being impacted in some way, shape, or form. And in my world, my career, working in higher education, specifically in undergraduate admissions, we also were being impacted. But the truth is, the pandemic was really a catalyst for what was already going on in many of our areas, right? It was a catalyst for the disenfranchisement that was already going on. It was an illumination, if you will, of individuals who had already been kind of cast aside between the margins. And not unlike, I should say, any other area, there were areas of disenfranchisement within my area of work as well. So for the past several years prior to that, researchers had been looking at the equity or the inequity within the application process for colleges. Anybody applying to colleges right now? Anyone? Okay, some of you have gone through this process. It can be extremely stressful. The truth is, there are gatekeepers, if you will. There are mechanisms that have been created to really make it difficult. I just want to kind of give some honesty today. One of those such things is called standardized testing. SAT, ACT. Anyone had to take the SAT or the ACT in your college process? It wasn't my favorite experience. In fact, I was a terrible test taker. But what I didn't know at the time was the origins or the history of standardized testing. As you look at the origins of specifically the SAT and the ACT, if we go back to the origins of higher education in this particular context, this country, it was created for a specific group of people. It was created actually for a religious elite. The first institutions, what we call now the Ivy League institutions, were all religious affiliated. And it was specifically for the upper aristocrats, the rich white men. So as time progressed and we became more integrated as a country, laws came into being to allow both women and people of the hue that you see before you to be able to go to school and colleges and higher learning. They had to come up with other systems to continue to gatekeep. They said, we're getting a little bit overpopulated. And so they crafted certain mechanisms, the application process, to sort of weed people out. So the SAT, the ACT actually were crafted specifically for individuals of that higher standard that they intended before. So you'll find that there are whole industries built around test prep. There are whole individual careers that are all sustaining this ideology that this test, this 3-hour period, will determine whether or not you are qualified for school. 3 hours? 3 hours is all that is necessary. You study your whole life. Maybe you've been a good student the whole time, or maybe you had to. Living in a black household like mine, I had to get A's and B's. That was a necessity. And yet I come to this test, this 3-hour moment, and I'm awful at it. And I'm feeling like a failure because I now am not being able to be admissible to the colleges that I see for myself. This test has been a barrier, a barricade. And so we come to this cataclysmic moment in the summer of 2020 where everyone decides, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Now there are certain people who can't even get access because all of the testing centers are closed down. And so they make a blanket statement, a swell across the nation to make what? Make the test optional. make the test optional. And so students are able to apply from all socioeconomic backgrounds. We are evening out the playing field. And it is in that moment that we realize that the test maybe wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. We enter our story here in Luke 14. Jesus is coming to a test. I think he knew it and he came prepared, but the religious elite, the context here is that it's a potluck. Anybody loves a potluck? This is a Sabbath potluck, and the religious elite or the conference officials of that time have invited Jesus over. And as you'll read through the Gospels, you'll find that there is not a single invitation that Jesus refused. If he was invited to your house, whether tax collector or Pharisee, he was coming. And so he gladly comes to this Sabbath potluck, and I can imagine that he is already aware of the fact that just a chapter before, these very same people, or the people affiliated with these people, have said that they want his life. They've gone and told Herod that this man must be stopped, and yet another group is inviting him over to his house. And so he enters into the room, and we'll pick up Luke 14, verses 1 through 6, as it reads. It says, now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But it says they kept silent. And he took him and healed him and let him go. Then he answered them, saying, which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. I want you to notice something really quickly. Spoiler alert, we're going to read it later on. But the man with the dropsy would not have been an invited guest. He was actually Jesus's plus one. Jesus comes in, he says, you invited me to potluck, so I'm going to bring whoever I may, and he brings this plus one. But I can imagine if I'm the man with dropsy, which is a condition at that time, which meant that there was fluid that was building up under the skin, which would cause a compounding ultimately to the organs to fail completely. He's in pain. He needs a breakthrough. He needs healing. And Jesus, you're taking me to a potluck? There's some of you right now in the room who feel like you are on display. You're in the midst of needing a breakthrough from God, and yet he seems to have you in front of a crowd. Maybe it's at work, maybe it's in front of your family. You're like, Jesus, I don't have time for this. I don't need to be the subject of your example. I just need my healing. And so he says, calm down, sir, just come with me. And so the story goes that as the man is sitting in front of Jesus, in front of this crowd of religious elite, who, by the way, would have been the ones who should have been servicing this man, but they didn't invite him to the potluck. The church people didn't want anything to do with him. And so Jesus brings him in. He's in an uncomfortable, hostile environment, if you will. And it says simply that Jesus heals him and lets him go. Heals him from his dropsy and lets him go. And he had asked a question, is it lawful to do good things on the Sabbath? Because he's trying to speak directly to their rules, these SAT, ACT, standardized testing rules that they've made for admissibility into Christianity, that they've made for admissibility into salvation. And he speaks directly to it. After the man has left, he compares him to some animals. I'll be honest, if I had been in the room, I'd say, Jesus, I'm not an ox, I'm not a donkey. Why are you comparing me to these animals? Maybe that's why he let him go. So he says, you would immediately pull your ox and your donkey out of a pit on the Sabbath. What is he talking about here? You see, the religious elite, these individuals had made a test. They had made a rule against healing on the Sabbath. But Jesus speaks directly to their hypocrisy because he says, you've made another rule that allows you to rescue this ox or this donkey. What's the significance? The significance is the ox represents their monetary value in that time. The ox was another stream of revenue. It meant the money that they had. The donkey would have been a form of transportation. And so this donkey represents money. And so he's saying to them, you're stuck on your money and you've made rules around your money, but you haven't made space for relationship. You haven't made space to save and heal this man, but yet you've made this entire system around protecting your investment. The very first rule we see here, the difference between fan to follower, is that the fan is consumed with their own investment. They've paid. They've had to invest money for their spot, for their seat. But the follower is consumed, is obsessed, is grateful because they know the investor. Someone's investing in them. And so Jesus is trying to break down these laws, these rules that they've made to keep people out. I want to set this up for you. He's in a room that has 3 walls. History states that these gatherings would typically have someone that is seated at the front. It would be the host. So where I'm standing right now would have a kingly-like seat. And then on the right and on the left side, they would have other seats for their honored guests. As we read here, I want you to picture this scene. Luke 14, we're still in the text, verses 7. We're going to go a little bit more. He says, "So he told a parable to those who were invited when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man. And then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Jesus recognizes that first they're stuck on their money. But then he also recognizes that they're stuck on their pursuit of status. See, the people in the room, they have, in the midst of passing over this man with dropsy, who could barely walk, they are running past this man who is sick to get to the best spot because they're trying to impress someone to raise higher in the rankings within this religious structure. And Jesus says, I can see, I've seen it. You even ran past me. I'm the invited guest, and I'm seated in the back. You've prioritized your ability to climb the ladder. He says, again, you're first stuck on money. And I'm wanting you to be stuck on relationship, but you're also stuck on your pursuit of status. So he tells this story. He says, wouldn't it make more sense to allow yourself to be elevated than to focus on elevating yourself? The truth is, Jesus is trying to say very simply, as a fan, you are consumed with where you're seated in the room. When you go to a concert, you're looking to get at the 100 level. Maybe you're trying to be courtside. He says, but if you would allow me, if you would follow me, I'll make sure you get to the best seat. The fan has to worry about whether they have the money, whether they have the cachet, the social capital to make moves in this world. But the follower understands that their social capital is all baked up, wrapped up in Jesus, and that he's going to get them exactly where they need to go. But as with most stories, or if you're in a classroom and there is a teacher, we always think that the lesson that's being told is for the person that's next to us. So I can imagine oftentimes my wife was having this scenario. She was talking about the fact that she knows her supervisor will send out these mass emails. Anybody can relate to this? And they'll pinpoint, we need to stop doing this, this, and this. And everyone's having a conversation about who exactly they're talking about, but it's never them, right? So yes, Hannah needs to stop leaving work early, right? But you're never leaving work early, right? And so there's an individual there, the host. I can imagine that he's smiling because there are all these scenarios that he's hearing, but he's like, none of this applies to me. So we read in verse 12, Jesus comes directly to his address. He says, then he also said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, that man with dropsy, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Jesus is speaking directly, kindly, gently, but to say you're just like these other individuals in the room. You've concocted a guest list that ultimately elevates your status in society. You have created a scenario that allows you to receive glory. He said, but what would be better is that if you took a follower mindset. The follower, remember, understands that they're being invested in. And so the money that they're being given, whatever is being invested in them is not theirs. And so they're able to freely give it knowing that they don't need to be repaid because it wasn't theirs in the first place. So Jesus is saying, look, you have all of this. You have this amazing home. You have these amazing resources, but you're spending it right back on yourself. He says, you're stuck on this money. You're stuck on this investment. You're stuck on your pursuit of status. You're stuck on your standing in society. And I really am trying to get you to be stuck on me. How many of us would confess? I asked this at first service, and we really only had one person who would be honest about it. But any of you would confess to being a bad texter? Okay, we've got a couple more in the room. A bad texter. I want to give a description because I don't think I did that very well. You are texting with someone. Maybe they're just asking you a quick question. It takes them several hours to get back to you, maybe several days. They're like, oh, I was busy. We're all busy, right? Everyone is busy, all right? But a bad texter, what we found, I was doing a little bit more research about the psychology around bad texters, and they actually say it's not necessarily that they're bad texters. There are some who just prefer a more interpersonal communication, right? They prefer to talk on the phone. Maybe they prefer in-person communication. But then there are others who, if they're honest, the reason why it feels like they're blowing you off is because that is a reflection of the relationship, right? What do I mean by this? The research shows that there are certain people that they will always text back right away. It might be a spouse, it might be a parent, maybe it might be their best friend, it might be a coworker, right? So it's not personal, it's just that they have a prioritization list, and me not receiving the text back just means that I'm not in their priority list, right? We read here, Luke, continuing on, I want you to keep that in mind, the prioritization list. It says that now he has an individual who really is not getting it. And so Jesus is like, okay, I've got to go a step deeper. And the man says, blessed is he who shall eat bread. This is verse 15, in the kingdom of God. Man, it's like, okay, I hear all this that you're saying, Jesus, but I can't wait to get to heaven. And Jesus responds, there was a certain man who gave a great supper and invited many. Verse 16. And sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, come, for all things are now ready. But they all with one accord began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of ground and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen and I am going to test them. I ask you to have me excused. Still another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So that servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor and the maimed and the lame and the blind, and that man with dropsy. And the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, and still there is room. And the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. So I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper. 3 excuses, but all very simplistic and easily applicable to our time today. The first, he says, I bought a piece of ground. I bought some land and I must go check it out. But he's saying that I must go check it out after he's purchased it. He would have already checked it out. But again, it's reflective, right, of his relationship to the master. The second, we talked about the ox and the fact that that is representative of commerce, of money, of wealth back in that day. And so he says, I've just bought some more oxen and I need to go test them to make sure that my investment is good. He would have done that before. But it is a reflection of his priority. And so he says, could you have me excused? The last one says, I've just married a wife and I cannot come. I'll be honest, that last one, I definitely gave that excuse. Not that I married a wife, but that my wife we got other things going on. We can't make it to this event. But here's the rub. The very first incident, he heals the man with dropsy. He gives the comparison to the ox and the donkey, saying, look, this is representative of your prioritization of your pursuit of money. Then he says, the second is your pursuit of status. But the third is your obsession with your blessings. So I'm not mad at you for wanting that land. I'm not mad at you for wanting those oxen. I'm not even mad at you for having that wife, because the key is I gave it to you. The master is making an invitation based upon the knowledge of all of these things already happening in these people's lives. He says, I know because I gave it to you. I blessed you. And yet the individuals are still obsessed with the blessing. A crowd has gathered, as often would happen when Jesus is speaking. And so there are people from near and far. I can imagine they've opened up the windows. There are people leaning in. They're hearing all of these different exchanges, and they're watching as Jesus is breaking down these lessons. And so I think it gets to a point where Jesus is like, there's too many people in here. So in my imagination, I can see he's already in the back of the room, remember, so he's closest to the exit anyway. And he says, I'm gonna finish this outside. And so he walks outside, and this is where we read Luke 14, verses 25. It says, now great multitudes went with him. So people are following him out of the room. It says, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, in his own life also, he cannot be my disciple, my follower. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. This word hate, it is immediately offends. It's meant to intentionally catch you off guard. If you read the original language around this word, it actually means to love less. Jesus is specifically saying the culminating statement after all of these three scenarios, from your money to your status to being obsessed with the blessing over the blesser. He says, ultimately, I need you to put me first. He says, in fact, it's going to be so uncomfortable that there are going to be times when it might feel like, or those individuals might feel, that you hate them because you're choosing me. But this is what this is what it requires to be my disciple. And so I can imagine that the crowd is starting to disperse because honestly, they're uncomfortable with these statements. You see, the truth is, Jesus has an inception way of communicating. He has been invited to a potluck. He's been invited to a banquet. The very first story that he uses to give a lesson to the individuals at the banquet is what? About a banquet. But his entire story is about inviting them all to a banquet. There's 3 levels. He's intentionally trying to speak to them about the very circumstances that they're in, using the circumstances that they're in. In the same way as how he's speaking to us right now. He's like, I've seen how you've prioritized money. I've seen how you've prioritized your investments. You've crafted your own sort of rules and regulations around how to protect that. You've crafted your pursuit even of your career, maybe even of status, whether it be in a relationship or otherwise. But the truth is, this is why I love God. It says the goodness of God is what leads to repentance, because his whole game plan is that I will continue to bless you and bless you and bless you and bless you. And once you realize who's blessing you, I'm hoping that you'll come home, hoping that you'll make room. I didn't tell you the whole story about the SAT and the ACT and standardized testing and all that's going on. 2020, all these institutions begin to go test optional. The truth is, it went splendid at first. Sure, there might have been some hiccups, but ultimately it provided opportunities for individuals who, like myself, maybe were never good test takers to have the opportunity to really vie for a chance, a spot in these upper echelon institutions. It leveled the playing field, if you will. But now, some 3 years later, researchers and data has been poured over, and they're finding that actually those students who apply test optional, many of them are struggling specifically in the math and the sciences. In fact, their scores have been much lower than their counterparts who did take testing. Other studies have shown that students who were in middle school during that time, their national averages are the lowest they've ever been in math and the sciences. So the natural reaction, in fact, the faculty at the institution that I work at, their natural response was, we need to immediately go back to testing. But the truth is, there's a lot more to the story. The first is, we were in a pandemic. There was virtually no in-person learning, if at all, for at least a year. And so the way that students were being taught, the resources that were being allocated, as I said, it was a cataclysmic moment that really further illuminated the terrible mechanisms that we had in place that were ultimately disadvantaging a certain number of students, right? And so ultimately, those students weren't getting the best instruction. And so naturally, the result would be that their scores would suffer. But the second piece here is that when we blanket took out the test and became test optional, we didn't account for the fact that we don't need to de-emphasize math and science. They're still important. What we need to then turn to is not focusing on the testing, but we need to focus on the relationship. We need to make sure that the students have a strong competence and understanding and a relationship to the math and the science. We neglected that. It's like the Pharisees, we got caught up in the tests. And yes, the tests might need to be eradicated, but we can't forget the relationship. Jesus says in Luke 13, just before this encounter, ironically, before his encounter, this banquet with these particular Pharisees, he says this about the master. Luke 13, verse 25, 26. He says, when once the master of the house has risen up and shut the door, and you begin to stand outside and knock at the door saying, remember the banquet, Lord, Lord, open for us. And he will answer and to say to you, I do not know you, where you are from. Then you will begin to say, and this is his definition of a fan, we ate and drank in your presence, and you taught in our streets. He said, Jesus, we were in the room. We followed you on social media. We gave to your GoFundMe. We were there. We saw the event. We saw you heal the man with dropsy. We saw the amazing things that you did in terms of community service at Bolingbrook. In fact, we even volunteered once upon a time. But he says, I don't know you. Why? Because the distinction between a fan and a follower is a fan makes room, physically or virtually, to get this in their schedule. The Pharisees, they made room for Jesus to be present. They even invited him to the house. But the truth is, they had not made room where it mattered most, which is relationally in their heart. So Jesus is saying very simply today, your priorities have been off. He says, yes, I have to say it in an offensive way, that you have to hate this person or that, but what I'm really trying to say is I want you to love everything less than me. Can you, in this moment, in your schedule, in your family, in your pursuits, in your dreams, can you make a decision? Can you make a determination that come what may, I will make room for you?